the Gray Man, the Werewolf of Wisteria, the Brooklyn Vampire, the Moon Maniac, the Boogeyman. Everything you just heard are all the nicknames for one guy. One guy who just happened to be one of the vilest pedophiles, serial child killers, and cannibals of all time. He had a pretty full resume and work experience in this department. If you were to take a look at this guy's family history, then you'd probably be able to have a little more understanding of the depth of madness and evil inside him. I mean, his mother had visual hallucinations, his sister was diagnosed with some kind of mental affliction, his uncle was diagnosed with mania, and his brother died at a mental institution. And that's just counting the ones that are confirmed. But yes, the name of the infamous monster we're currently talking about was Hamilton Howard Albert Fish. Now, Little Fish was born on May 19, 1870 in Washington, D.C. to Randall and his wife Ellen Fish. And guess what? Randall was 43 years older than Ellen. That's right, this guy could have been her grandfather. So this basically meant that Randall was already 75 years old when little Albert was born. Well, that's not a dad, that is a relic. Sadly, Randall Fish died when Albert was just 5 years old. Respect. Probably from the sheer exhaustion of keeping up with a toddler at age 80. And unfortunately for the kids, the death of her husband pushed Ellen over the edge. Now, in a more heartwarming story, this would have been the part where she found strength and love to provide for little Albert and his siblings. But this is not one of those stories. Ellen dumped them all in different orphanages, and if you know anything about institutionalized care in the 1870s, then you'd know this probably was the worst thing that could have happened to young Albert. According to Albert himself, he got exposed to many beatings and sadistic acts of brutality. He was beaten up almost daily by the other kids, and even by the nuns too, of course. The nuns would allegedly strip the children naked in front of everyone before whipping them. He saw young boys doing many things they weren't supposed to be doing, like mutilation, sexual assault, and even started looking forward to the abuse because it brought him pleasure. After a while, it was said that the beatings and assault would make him climax. Yeah, an 8-year-old boy climaxing from physical torture. Ew. So, as you can already see, we're not off to a great start on this one. Well, in 1880, when Albert was 10 years old, his mother got her act together somewhat and decided she wanted her children back. So, she brought him back to the family home, which sounds like a good thing, but honestly by this point the damage was already done. The young boy had developed an unhealthy relationship with pain, punishment, and suffering. He was now fully self-harming as he'd cut himself with broken bottles, stick pins up his frickin' testicles, and whip himself to climax. It was also at this time that he began a relationship with another boy who introduced him to drinking urine and eating feces. These two were personally recycling their own, homemade products. By his late teens, Albert had fully embraced sadomasochism, which is a fancy way of saying he liked pain, both giving and receiving. Now, during this era, it was very normal for young women looking for husbands to place personal ads in the newspaper seeking out marriage proposals. They described their qualities, likes, dislikes, and what they were looking for in a man. It was like the 1800s version of Tinder. And guess who started his new hobby on this? Why, Albert Fish, of course. However, it didn't just stop at reading. The guy would write back to them, describing in graphic detail the sexual acts he would like to share with them. These descriptions were so vile, so disturbing, and ultimately so disgusting that they were never made public, though they were later admitted in court as evidence. We will circle back to that part later, but honestly, the fact that the letters were too disturbing to publish makes a whole lot of sense. What would you expect from a guy who eats his own poop, for God's sake? Now, as if he wasn't already twisted enough, he found a job at one of his all-time favorite places, the bathroom, as a, wait for it, sex worker. He kept on as a sex worker all the way into his 20s, and it was at this time he decided to relocate to New York. Soon after, he met a new friend who was a steamer captain in New York named John Davis. The now 24-year-old Albert and the captain would hang out on his boat at the docks all the time. During this period, there was a really bad ongoing disaster, the North Chinese famine of 1876 to 1879, and the captain's ship had a regular route through China. During this famine, it's estimated that over 13 million people died from starvation, so it was a no-brainer that food was very, very scarce, especially meat, and scarcity equals demand. In fact, some parents in China at the time were so desperate that they would sell their children for a slice of beef. I'm not kidding, guys, there's actual proof of this. Well, it turns out that dear Captain John was also a really sick man, because he would buy these kids and then cannibalize them himself. This captain would confess all these disturbing things to Albert during their alone time, and would even tell him that their asses were the most delicious part ever and tasted like veal. Again, totally unbelievable, right? But guys, there is actual freaking proof of this. So as you can already tell, Albert too became interested in cannibalism. Despite being a walking red flag, Albert Fish found himself a bride, although it wasn't exactly a whirlwind romance, as it was his mother who arranged the marriage in 1898, probably thinking that a wife might fix him. That poor bride was 9 years younger, meaning she had no idea what she had just entered into, a marriage straight out of a nightmare. They went on to have 6 children together: Albert Jr., Anna, Gertrude, Eugene, John, and Henry. At this point, Albert had stopped sex working and was now a painter because, he had a family to support, right? Well, wrong, because the painting gig was just a cover for more perverse desires. As a house painter, he had the perfect excuse to travel often and would disappear for days to indulge in his madness. He began targeting people who, according to him, wouldn't be missed by anyone. So, he selected states largely populated with African American children and disabled people with mental health issues. Yeah, he's totally graduated from eating poop to becoming a piece of poop. His first confirmed act of horror happened when he met a 19-year-old intellectually disabled man named Thomas Kedden. Fish kidnapped him, took the boy to an abandoned farmhouse, and tortured him relentlessly for 14 days. He mutilated, cut off, and feasted on his genitals, and when he was done, deciding to show mercy by letting him go, because apparently that's what mercy looks like in Albert Fish's world. Now, his poor wife at home was struggling to remain with this monster she married, and for 2 decades, she somehow endured his insanity. But then, in a surprising turn of events, she ran off with John Straub, a handyman who had done work for the family home. Well, this was exactly the final push that threw Albert off the deep end. He began hearing voices and suffering from religious delusions. He would declare himself Christ before asking his children to hit his buttocks with a paddle until he bled. His growing obsession with pain manifested itself as self-harm, most infamously pushing needles into his groin, eventually pushing them so deep that they could not be retrieved. Sometimes he'd stuff wads of wool into his rectum, soak them in lighter fluid, and set them on fire, then put it out before he could suffer serious burns. Eventually, Fish's eldest son, unable to put up with his father's bizarre behavior any longer, threw him out. Now a wandering menace, Fish started targeting young boys and girls, often using newspapers and job offers to lure them in. By 1924, his terrifying transformation from self-inflicting masochist to full-blown child predator was complete, and with a face that screamed harmless old grandpa, Fish became every parent's worst nightmare, a real-life monster hiding in plain sight. On July 11, 1924, Albert set his sights on 8-year-old Beatrice Keel, a sweet little girl living on a Staten Island farm. Using a classic help-me-with-a-harmless-task trick, Fish tried to lure her away by asking if she'd help him pick rhubarbs. Luckily, her mother, Mrs. Keel, had the common sense of a horror movie final girl, because the moment she saw the shady old man loitering around her property, she chased him off faster than a raccoon in a trash can. While Fish failed to snatch Beatrice, he didn't just give up. Just 4 days later, on July 15th, he took Francis X. McDonnell, a 9-year-old boy from Long Island. Unlike his previous failed attempt, this time, nobody was there to stop him. Francis was playing in his neighborhood when he vanished. His parents, alarmed by the sudden disappearance, launched a frantic search party. Tragically, the search ended in horror when his little body was discovered in the woods, brutally beaten and strangled. Witnesses later recalled seeing a strange elderly man wandering the area, but no one suspected the full extent of the horror they were dealing with. On February 11, 1927, 4-year-old Billy Gaffney was enjoying a carefree game of hide-and-seek with his 3-year-old friend Billy Beaton and Billy's 12-year-old brother. But when the game ended, little Billy Gaffney was nowhere to be found. When the police questioned Billy Beaton, they asked what happened to his friend. His chilling response was, "The boogeyman took him." And unfortunately, Billy Beaton was not speaking metaphorically. Fish dragged Billy Gaffney into a house near the Riker Avenue dumps, turning the child's innocent game into a nightmare beyond words. He kept the boy captive overnight, returning at 2 p.m. the next day to finish what he started. What followed was a level of brutality that even seasoned detectives struggled to comprehend. Fish tortured the child to death, prolonging his suffering in ways too horrific to describe. He dismembered Billy's body, cutting off his head, arms, and legs below the knees, stuffed the remains into weighted sacks, and tossed them into nearby ponds. And then, because Fish's depravity knows no limits, he cannibalized the thighs and torso over the next 4 days. That's right, 4 days of feasting on human flesh. If vampires existed, they would be freaked out by this guy. Sadly, with no one restraining him, Fish was free to roam the streets searching for his next victim, and when he found Grace Budd in 1928, he would commit his most infamous crime, one so grotesque that it would cement his reputation as one of the most twisted serial killers in history. Apparently, Grace's 18-year-old elder brother Edward Budd had put out a classified ad looking for a job, and Fish answered. He introduced himself as Mr. Frank Howard, met with Edward and his family to discuss Edward's future. Fish told the family that he was a Long Island farmer looking to pay a strong young worker $15 a week. The job seemed ideal, and the Budd family, excited by Edward's luck in finding the job, instantly trusted the gentle, polite Mr. Howard. The initial plan was actually to kill Edward, but when he took one look at the guy, he knew the kid would fight back. Turns out serial killers have to factor in the resistance issue. However, as soon as he set his eyes on Edward's 10-year-old sister, the plan took a much more horrifying turn. Fish told the Budd family that he would be returning the following week to take Edward and a friend to his farm to begin working, but he failed to appear on the day he promised. Fish sent a telegram apologizing and setting a new date to meet with the boys. When Fish arrived on June 4th as promised, he came bearing gifts of potted cheese and strawberries for all the Budd children, which he claimed were from his farm. Yeah, right. After lunch, Fish explained that he had to attend a children's birthday party at his sister's home and would return later to pick Edward and his friend up, but suggested that the Budds allow him to take Grace with him to the birthday party. The unsuspecting parents agreed and dressed her in her Sunday best. Grace, excited about going to a party, left the house and was never seen alive again. Fish took Grace to an abandoned house in Rochester that he had specifically chosen for his gruesome plans. While she picked flowers outside, he went inside and, brace yourself, undressed so he wouldn't get blood on his clothes. This was next-level premeditation. When he was ready, he called Grace upstairs, stripped her, and choked her to death before cannibalizing her remains over the next 9 days. Yeah, 9 days. Now, you'd think someone this messed up would at least try to keep a low profile after committing such a monstrous crime. But no, Fish was as bold as he was stupid. The investigation, led by William F. King, dragged on for 5 years with no solid leads, and then Fish, proving that some killers just can't resist the brag, decided to send Mrs. Budd a letter on November 11th, 1938. But not just any letter. This was a full-blown graphic confession detailing exactly what he had done to Grace. As if to provide solace to Mrs. Budd, Fish stated emphatically that Grace had not been sexually assaulted. And yeah, that somehow makes it all better. Thankfully, the police were able to trace the paper the letter was written on using some handwriting analysis and comparing documents to known samples, and this eventually led them to a flophouse where Fish was living. Fish was arrested and immediately confessed to killing Grace and other children, and he was even smiling as he described the grisly details of tortures and murders. According to the detectives on the case, he looked like the devil himself. On March 11th, 1935, Fish's trial began, and he pleaded innocent by reason of insanity. He said voices in his head told him to kill children and commit other horrendous crimes. Despite the numerous psychiatrists who described Fish as insane, the jury found him sane enough and guilty after a 10-day trial. He was sentenced to death, and on January 16, 1936, Fish was electrocuted at Sing Sing Prison in Ossining, New York. Allegedly, he also looked upon this process as the ultimate sexual thrill, and even though the assessment was dismissed as a rumor, personally, I really don't think it was.